Russia's invasion of Ukraine has moved into week two, and there are no signs of this unprovoked attack ending anytime soon. Close to 2 million Ukrainians have left the country. More than 1 million of those are children and women. People are dead in the streets. They have no food to eat. They have no water to drink. And many have no way out of this war-torn country. This has caused a humanitarian crisis, the likes of which have not been seen since World War II. Experts expect Putin to only double down in the incoming days with his violence as the Ukrainian government continues to mount a formidable resistance. While the war plays out, sanctions against Russia intensified by the U.S. U.S. gas prices are soaring. A WNBA superstar is stuck in Russia, and experts debate whether the U.S. and other NATO countries should impose a no-fly zone and other measures to stop Putin's brazen and violent attack. Experts are here to break it all down. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
You can barely turn on the television or go to your internet sites, your social media sites without seeing some kind of coverage of this attack by Russia of the Ukrainian government, its people, the civilian casualties, the humanitarian crisis that's developing. And also there are lots of other side stories that are growing out of this Russian invasion, including stories about the WNBA star Brittany Griner, who's apparently been arrested and stuck in Russia. There's stories about Russia bans on Russia oil by the U.S. and what that means for the U.S. economy, soaring gas prices, and so many other stories that have a direct impact on Americans. So we wanted to start this morning's show talking about that story that I don't think is getting enough attention, and it is the story of Brittany Griner. So I have two of our leading sports experts with us this morning to help us understand what's happening with Brittany's case. Joining us is award-winning sports journalist Jim Watson and University of Michigan sports and race expert Dr. Ketra Armstrong. They both are returning guests to the special report. Good morning, Jim, and good morning, Professor Armstrong.
Morning.
Think of two better people to talk to this morning about this Brittany Griner story. It's getting some attention, but not a whole lot of attention. So for those folks who maybe haven't even heard this story, why don't we start with you, Professor Armstrong. Tell us who Brittany Griner is. Let's start there.
Brittany Griner, in many regards, is like a unicorn. And I mean that in the most positive way. She's 6'9" female. She's an outstanding athlete. She's one of the few people who has had success as a college champion, as a WNBA champion. She represents the U.S. Olympic team. And what she does and the way she plays the game is so incredible that people often masculinize her. They compare her to the men. And so Brittany she's just kind of elevated women's basketball on her own terms, in her own way, not being afraid to unapologetically be who she is. She's an out lesbian, so she's clear with her sexuality, and she's just very proud. And so she has become one of the faces of the WNBA. And it's because of that appeal that, other countries are also interested in what she can bring to them. So Brittany Griner, the long and the short of it is she's an outstanding women's basketball player, an outstanding basketball player, regardless of her sex. She's an outstanding basketball player, and she is redefining what women's basketball can look like.
Okay, fantastic explanation of who she is for those folks that may not be familiar with her. So now, Jim, I'll ask you, what has happened to Brittany and why is her story intertwined with the story of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine?
Well, Russia will tell you it has nothing to do with their invasion of Ukraine, but she's obviously a political pawn. Look, we did this ourselves, not the United States, but the sporting industry did this. We poked the bear, right? We've sanctioned Russian athletes all over the world in multiple sports. Up to 30 sports now have sanctions against Russian and Belarusian athletes. And so we had to expect some kind of retaliation. And just like the professor told you, Brittany Griner is a huge name. She's one of the top 3 basketball players on earth. She's fantastic. And she stands out, of course. You imagine her walking through the Moscow airport. Everyone knows who she is. So this is just retaliation.
In fact, Jim, let's take a step back and tell us what happened to Britney, because I don't think everybody knows the story. Unless you are hypersensitive and watching these stories very closely, you might have missed the Britney Griner story.
No, and it's funny that you say that, because there was something trending on yesterday that I saw on the internet that said, why is this not one of the biggest stories in the world right now? Well, there's a war going on. The economy, the stock market's bouncing off the walls. And so maybe this is over in the corner and you actually have to pay some attention. Here's what happens. So she plays during the summer months, she plays in the WNBA and she makes $221,000 a year. She goes, like many players do in the offseason, to play in Russia. A lot of the oligarchs in Russia have women's basketball teams. They're toys for them, but they draw big crowds and they bring in big money. Griner makes more than $1 million a year, and she's been doing it for 7 years. So she had been playing in the Russian league up until January 29th was her last appearance. Then there was a break as everyone went home to play for their national teams for World Cup qualifying. When she returned to Russia, going through the Moscow airport, all of a sudden Russian customs finds vape cartridges with cannabis oil in her luggage. Now, you have to wonder, is this the first time she's ever moved these through? Is this the first time they've ever found them? Or were they looking for something? Were they looking for a reason? It's interesting to note that Americans, by and large, who have been arrested in Russia, it's for drug charges, which is a big deal in any culture. In Russia, this kind of violation is punishable by up to 10 years. So she's been incarcerated now for up to 2 weeks. What's strange, Areva, we don't even know the date. The Russians haven't even told us the date they arrested her. They said last month. So we're going on 2 to 3 weeks right now.
And I was going to ask you that, Professor Armstrong, the information coming out about Britney is so sketchy. It's so vague. As Jim said, we can't even pinpoint the day that she was seen walking through customs. We don't know the date that she was arrested. We don't know what the status of these legal proceedings are. And we don't even know if the Russian legal proceedings look like U.S. proceedings. But I am reading that she has some kind of representation, some kind of Russian lawyer, that the organized sporting association that she plays for is involved. So given that there are professionals involved, why do you think we're not hearing more concrete information?
Well, first and foremost, let's not forget that she is a female athlete. I would venture to say if this was a high-profile male athlete that had the same cachet and marketing appeal that Britney has, we would know more. Everyone would know more.
If this were LeBron, for instance, right?
Without a doubt, and so that's part of it. And, I do think that, as my colleague here was saying, in other countries, oftentimes they really do take care of the female athlete. They take care of the American athletes better than we do in some regards here. They're valued there. That's one of the reasons they go there. It's not just the money. They can make a lot more money, 4 times their salary, but there's a level of protection. There's a level of celebrity. There's a level of stardom that they experience. And so I do think that there are some, people there in Russia who wants her to do well, who wants her to get out of this situation. As he mentioned, the oligarchs, they want to win at any cost. That's why they pay so much money. And winning, it's all about winning, whatever it takes. So I know that there's some things going on behind the scenes because they want their teams to win. Now, how they balance winning with being in a war is a whole different conversation, but we're having this conversation about who is Britney Griner and why is this not a bigger story? Because she's a female athlete and she's in the sport of basketball. Basketball doesn't have the same, women's basketball in this country, it doesn't have the same position in the culture as other sports. Even those feminine sports like tennis, or gymnastics or some of those other sports, or even soccer, women's soccer. We talked a lot about women's soccer. Women's basketball doesn't have that place in American culture. And so there's still lots of questions, lots of unknowns. And we're still trying to convince people that this is a story. We're trying to convince people that it's worthy of their time and their attention. And so partly because it is a women's sports issue. But I think the other part is there are still lots that we don't know what's happening in Russia. Right. And we don't know what's happening on our soil to help resolve the situation either.
Yeah, Jim, why aren't we hearing more from the WNBA? I would imagine they have a vested interest in protecting their players. One of their star players is stuck in this country, and we're not hearing a lot from them other than they're working with officials and, they're cognizant of the story. But I haven't seen an official from the WNBA come out, the president or whomever that may be, to talk about this issue and demand that the U.S. get involved in trying to, negotiate her release. What's going on with the sport?
Yeah, the WNBA is kind of taking a step back, and they're letting Brittany Griner's agent, Lindsay Collis, kind of be the spokesman for the family. She's talking about the legal representation in Russia, and we'll see what that means exactly. Also, Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, is aware of this. He's made comments on national news outlets that we're aware that Brittany Griner has been detained. We're trying to work with this. Remember that she's not the only American that's detained in Russia. Trevor Reed, a U.S. Marine, has been detained since 2019 for the charge of public intoxication, which after several months was upgraded to assaulting. He's been held in Russia for 3 years. Yesterday, his parents were trying to get to President Biden, who eventually made a phone call to them in Fort Worth, Texas, said, I'm aware of that as well. There are Americans being held in Venezuela, Citgo executives who are accused of embezzlement. One of those gentlemen had been held for 4 years, the other for over a year. They were actually both released yesterday. That probably has something to do with anticipated oil leases that are coming up right now. So it's all intertwined. And understand that this whole thing is because Brittany Griner is a name. People do recognize that name. They know who she is. Ever since she came out of Nimitz High School in Houston, everyone in the country that follows basketball, women's basketball, athletics at any level, you know who she is. She won a national title at Baylor. She won a WNBA championship. She won 2 Olympic gold medals. She is a symbol. And again, it's a woman. She's Black. She's out. This is everything Russia needs right now, just to tweak us just a little bit.
So, Professor Jim, you're right. Secretary Blinken did say he's aware of this, but I also heard a U.S. congressman say, I don't know if there's anything we can do because—
John Mendy from California, yeah.
Yes, Jared Mendy said typically this would be a diplomatic negotiated release, and we're not talking to Russia right now. Russia is on our enemy list, so not likely that we're going to have any civil diplomatic conversations about release of someone like Brittany Griner. He didn't seem very positive. So, Professor Armstrong, is that typically how someone like her would be released? There would be some diplomatic negotiation that takes place between the two countries?
I think it could. Again, we protect what we value. And again, because I think it's in this shroud of being women's sports, there are some people on the political landscape who also don't give it the justice that it deserves. So I think that's part of it. But yes, I do think if you think about this person being the person that she is, the symbol that she represents for women's sports at the intersection of race and sexuality and a number of other issues, yes, I mean, I think it is deserving. But it's when you think about the context and the broader context of what's going on, I get it when people say, well, it's just sports and it's women's sports. It's not that big of a deal. I mean, I get that. But for the little girls who are looking up to Brittany, and for those who are following women's sports, for those who are in favor of women's empowerment, for those who are in favor of just civility, this has to be an issue. And so, yes, I think it does warrant some intervention. But, we know that what people value, it becomes like an amoeba. It changes when the context changes, right? When we're in the Olympic year, we may be having a different conversation. And so, yes, I do think that it warrants more intervention. I think it deserves the efforts as any other high-profile American citizen, be they as athlete or otherwise. I think it does deserve better.
Jim, one of the things that Congressman said, in addition to saying, I don't know about a diplomatic solution here, he raised the issue of her sexuality. And made reference to the fact that Russia has very strict anti-gay laws.
Yeah, it's a violation.
Yeah, so he said, I don't know if this is at play here, but obviously Brittany's been going there, as you said, for the last 7 years. They know she's a gay woman. She's married. Her wife is very vocal. So there's no secret that she's a lesbian. But do you think that could have anything to do with this? And as you think about that, the other question is, we heard Biden before the attack by Russia on Ukraine telling Americans, get out, leave, it's not safe. And I've also heard some people online suggest well, Brittany, you were told not to go there. So the fact that you went against the admonition of the government, don't expect the government now to come and save you. Do you think any of that sentiment is at play here too? So those two questions for you.
All of this that you're talking about is window dressing. These are just reasons. These are excuses that they had to detain her and find something in her luggage. If she did indeed have vape cartridges in there, that's her mistake. She made a mistake there. But I'll tell you what, here's the irony of this whole thing. Not a U.S. congressman, not Anthony Blinken, not Joe Biden, but her best resource, the most leverage right now, will be the oligarch who owns her team in Russia, because he has Putin's ear, and because he's a Russian, and because this is a sports term, his property, right? Because he wants to protect her. Now understand, if something happens to Brittany Griner, or she's incarcerated for a long term, this crushes women's basketball in Russia. What doesn't sound like a big thing to Americans, but it's a big deal. This is a big business in Russia. So they're going to take good care of her. Can you imagine the damage it does to the brand when they're trying to bring players from overseas? Because it's the American players that fill seats in Russia. The domestic players, all very good, but Russian fans see them all the time. They want to see the best players in the world. They want to see Brittany Griner. So I guarantee they're going to take good care of her. They're going to try to string this out and make us twist in the wind and beg and grovel to try and get Brittany Griner out. But the question is, will Griner go back? When everything settles down in Ukraine and Europe, will she go back? Will she play? Will foreign players, American players, Canadian players, will they go play in Russia? Because those oligarchs have a lot of money invested in this league. It's big business.
Mm-hmm. And that's a great question about will American athletes return to Russia. But let's talk a little about this pressure that Jim says needs to be applied to the owner of the team. That's not typically the way these athletes are released, is it? Or is that the way? Is that commonly done? Are there examples like this that we can point to, Professor Armstrong, that you are aware of, or maybe you, Jim, where you've had the team owner be the conduit through which someone is released from custody?
You know, I can't give you a specific example, so I'll defer to my colleague. But listen, let's not underestimate the proximity to power that these oligarchs have. They are powerful, very influential. They have political clout. And that's one of the reasons that they're able to do what they do in elevating the Americans that come there. So I do think they have that kind of power. And like we were talking about earlier, they want to win. They spare no expense. That's why they're paying millions of dollars to the athletes. That's why the athletes are flocking to these countries, because the oligarchs are sparing no expense, and winning matters. And so I do think that we should not underestimate their power. And given the prominence of women's basketball in Russia, if this could cause a crumbling, if they don't handle this matter, if they don't protect Brittany Griner, other athletes will not. Because listen, Brittany is the best of the best. And if she says, listen, I'm not going back, those who don't have her skills, who don't have her marketability, they're not going to go. So there are some long-term implications for the success of Russian basketball, depending on how this is handled.
Yeah, and Professor Armstrong, you bring up great points with these oligarchs. And you know what it really comes down to? You guys know this. They're men. They have egos. They don't want to lose to their rival oligarch. These guys brag to each other. They see each other all the time. This is why they own these teams, so they can have these little battles. So the guy who owns Ekaterinburg, the team that she plays for, I guarantee he knows exactly what's going on. He knows where she is. And I think they're going to take pretty good care of her. They're going to make her. Do
you think she's going to be released anytime soon, Jim? You keep saying take good care of her. If you're detained, even if it's a good prison, you're still in detention.
Yeah,
so,
not right away. Yeah, I mean, that's why I brought up the other names. The Marine, Trevor Reed, who's been there for 3.5 years now, and the guys that were in Venezuela. Yeah, they're gonna keep her for a little while. They don't have any pressure to release her as long as she's in good health. Now you have to wonder, how does it affect her physically? How does it affect her emotionally, mentally? She's in a foreign country that's at war right now. This cannot be a comfortable position for her.
Yeah. How do we keep this story alive, Jim? Like you said, you saw it trending. I've been looking for the story every day. You have to look for it. It doesn't pop up. I'm not getting alerts about it. It's not front page of any of the major papers. How do we keep it alive?
Well, it's funny because I read every morning. I read all the news and I listen to podcasts, and everybody wants to talk about the war, rightfully so. So this story is always going to be a sidebar. It's always going to be a second or third page story. So, shows like this and people like this that keep talking about it. But of course, you have to feed the animal, right? So if nothing else comes out, and we're talking about it's so foggy right now, we don't have any detail. So each time a detail comes out, but it's going to come through, sportsillustrated.com. These guys, New York Times is following the story. CNN is on the story. They will do it. But of course, it's a back burner story right now until something else concrete happens.
Yeah. Well, we got to leave it there. Thank you so much. We're going to keep following it. And I've seen the post by Brittany's wife, whole family. They did a big group shot showing their support and their love for her. I imagine it has to be really difficult for her family with whatever information they have. Doesn't seem to be really solid and credible information at this point. At least they're not giving that to the public. But we wish her the best, as well as all of those other, thank you, Jim, for mentioning those other folks who are detained in these countries. It's not just Brittany, there are others as well. So our prayers go out to them, and hopefully there's some resolution that gets these folks home. I can't even imagine being stuck in a foreign country. You know, the language barrier, the difference in the judicial system and all the differences. It must be a pretty harrowing experience for her and the others. But thank you so much, Jim, and thank you, Professor Armstrong, for lending your insights on this issue. We're going to continue to follow it. Watch this space, as we say. All right, my next guest is Professor Ilya Somin. He is a professor at George Mason University. He is also the author of multiple books, including Free to Move, Foot Voting, Migration, and Political Freedom. Professor Somin wrote an op-ed in the New York Times this week arguing that by helping the Ukrainian refugees, it can actually weaken Putin. Good morning and welcome, Professor Somin.
Thank you very much for having me.
So you wrote this really thoughtful op-ed piece, and I know it's been blowing up. Lots of folks have interest in it. And let's just start by your basic argument. So tell us what your basic premise is about how the U.S. can weaken Russia by accepting Ukrainians into this country.
So Ukrainians, and also in the article I talked about Russian migrants as well. On the Ukrainian side, obviously, as we've all seen in the news, there's now up to 2 million refugees who have fled the war. Helping them is both a humanitarian imperative, and also it could be a benefit to our economy and that of our allies. We suffer from a labor shortage. Immigrants contribute a lot to the economy. Given the chance, Ukrainian refugees could do so as well. We can more directly weaken Putin if we also adopt a policy of accepting Russian migrants. There are many people in Russia who do not like the Putin regime or would just prefer to live in a freer and more successful society. And historically, Russian immigrants, like other immigrants, have disproportionately contributed to scientific and other innovation. If we let more of them in, we can have more of that innovation in the US, and less of it will be contributing to Putin's war machine. In addition, obviously, if large numbers of Russians reject Putin's regime in favor of living in the US, that's a very significant, you can call it a propaganda success, if you like, or a public relations success. The US understood this during the Cold War. That's why I'm in the US. I was a refugee from the Soviet Union way back then, and it could work to our advantage here as well if we are open to the Ukrainian refugees, but also Russians as well.
What kind of pushback are you getting? I know you anticipate some of it in the article, because I read the article where you address what you anticipated to be the pushback from those that say we shouldn't play favorites with Ukrainians and Russian refugees when we have banned others coming into the country. Others are saying that you don't want to siphon off these Russians that oppose Putin. We want to leave them in the country so they can continue to oppose Putin. But what other pushback have you gotten on this argument?
It's only been 24 hours, but so far I've gotten very little pushback. To the contrary, what I've gotten are positive responses from a large number of people saying, oh, this is a great idea, we should do it. That doesn't mean either the Biden administration or Congress necessarily will do anything, but I think maybe what has happened with this war has cut across some of the usual politics of immigration, that even people who are very anti-immigrant in many other contexts, they're open at least to Ukrainian refugees, and may even be open to the Russians as well, if it's portrayed as combating Putin rather than about being generally open to immigration, which, by the way, I would like to do. But for some people, this would be viewed as a special case. So far, I've gotten almost entirely positive reactions, even though in the article I addressed several potential counter arguments, some of which I have seen in other media. There are people who have raised this issue. Are we open to Ukrainian refugees, or are European countries open primarily because they're white, whereas non-white refugees from, say, Syria is a different story? To my mind, we should be open to both, but the way to address this issue is by leveling up, not leveling down. So we shouldn't say, well, we banned the others, we should ban Ukrainians too. What we should say is we should be as open as possible to people fleeing violence and tyranny.
Yeah, and that was my thought as I was reading it, I was thinking about the Haitian refugees. I was thinking about refugees from Africa and how close this country has been to some of those refugees, people of color primarily, and thinking myself in racial terms about this, because I don't think, I mean, that's the reality of the U.S. where we live, and these matters are racialized. So what would you say to those people that say, look, when we're talking about people of color, when we're talking about Africans, when we're talking about people from Haiti, there isn't this generosity, there isn't this policy of open borders, bring them all in?
So I would say two things. One is we don't at this point have an open borders policy for Ukrainian refugees either. We have moved somewhat to greater openness in the last few days, but it hasn't gone all the way. But the other thing I would say is I would amplify the point I made earlier that when there is an injustice, which there is when we keep out African and Haitian and other refugees, whereas wedding and others, the way to address it is by leveling up, not leveling down, by improving the treatment of those kept out rather than by keeping out even some of the people that we currently let in. I would analogize it to the problem. It's an imperfect analogy, but I would analogize it to the problem of racial profiling in law enforcement. The solution is for police where they abuse African Americans or other non-whites to end that abuse rather than say, well, the police should abuse white people more so as to solve the problem that way. I think also, historically, the U.S. has taken significant numbers of non-white refugees as well, though there also have been situations where we've unjustly kept them out.
Yeah, what do we make of some of the reports we're hearing, even in the Ukraine, about the treatment of African students there, about discrimination that they are facing, about being treated differently, being stopped at checkpoints, being denied access to buses and trains? What do you make of that?
I think undoubtedly at least some of those reports are true. There is a great deal of racism in Ukraine, as in Russia and in many other European countries, but particularly even more so in Eastern Europe than perhaps in the West, where in the West, the American civil rights movement had more of an impact on people's thinking on such matters. At the same time, it's worth noting that the Ukrainian government has condemned this kind of unequal treatment and has said that people should be treated equally regardless of race. Obviously, in the middle of a war in particular, it's not easy for them, even when they have good intentions, it's not easy for them to enforce that idea of equal treatment against officials on the ground and others, who may not be taking a lot of direction from the central government. I would add also that the European Union has also said that refugees should be treated equally regardless of race. But once again, as in the US, where we try to combat racial profiling and the like, but we don't always succeed. And our ideals and the Europeans' ideals don't always translate into reality on the ground.
Yeah, and the notion that we should let some of the Russian refugees, you said, because some of them have expertise in science and technology, and they would be a benefit to the U.S. in those areas. Aren't we in the process of, or some people are in favor of actually kicking Russians out of the U.S. rather than bringing them in? What's happening with those efforts?
So far, that has not been done, and it's a good thing that it hasn't been done in that I think here, as in other contexts, it is wrong to punish people for things that they don't control merely because they belong to a particular ethnic or racial group or have a particular citizenship. Russian immigrants in the U.S., Russian students in the U.S., most of them have little or no control over the policy of the Russian government. Many of them even oppose those policies, but so punishing them would be wrong, and it would also be counterproductive because we would be depriving ourselves of the skills of those people and instead giving them back to Vladimir Putin. I would add also that these proposals to kick out students, if they were taken seriously, they would kick out even such people as the daughter of Alexei Navalny, who is Russia's leading opposition leader. He's in prison right now because he opposes Putin. So it seems silly to say, well, we should kick out even his daughter because she happens to be Russian. Again, the only beneficiary would be Putin, and we certainly wouldn't be benefiting ourselves, and we'd be committing an injustice in the process. But fortunately, those ideas haven't gained that much political momentum, at least as of yet.
What about families of oligarchs that are in the U.S.? Should they be allowed to stay? And should we accept families of oligarchs that maybe want to come into the country from Russia?
I would argue that just as we shouldn't punish people for the bad behavior of others of the same race, ethnicity, or nationality, similarly, we shouldn't punish people for the bad behavior of their family members. If an individual...
Let me ask you this, do you draw a line? So I'm the wife of an oligarch and I am complicit in his activities to support Putin, but I want to get out. Would I be allowed in under your plan?
So my view is that people should not be punished for bad things that their family members do, and therefore merely being the wife of an oligarch or the daughter of an oligarch should not be enough to subject you to punishment. You did use the word complicit. If that individual had herself done something bad, like be involved in promoting Putin's oppression, that might be a different story. But again, she should be judged by what she did herself rather than by what her husband did or her father did, and so on.
So at this moment, help us understand what the level of crisis is, because we're seeing all these stories, literally people who don't have food, they don't have water. There are talks about how the people who are getting out are people who are more affluent, who have resources, but the people who are poor, who don't have money and access, aren't as successfully being able to exit. Just what is the situation like on the ground of these millions of refugees?
So there are 2 million, at least, probably more by now, who have actually left Ukraine. There are also many hundreds of thousands, we don't know exactly how many, who are internally displaced. Some of them may be the more affluent, but a great many are definitely not. And by the way, a person who's affluent by Ukrainian standards can still be relatively poor by Western standards, because Ukraine is a poor country, poorer than Mexico in terms of its level of income. So it is a very bad situation, and it is getting worse over time because Russian forces are moving closer to some of the major cities. They've cut off water and power in some areas. And so, every day the estimated number of refugees goes up by hundreds of thousands.
Have we seen a crisis? Everyone keeps comparing this to World War II. Is that the best analogy in terms of what we're seeing as it relates to the civilian casualties and the number of refugees?
So certainly on the continent of Europe, there has not been a refugee crisis of this magnitude since World War II. There is one of somewhat comparable magnitude in Venezuela and the surrounding countries because of the socialist regime there and the horrible oppressive policies they've enacted. I don't remember the exact figure, but there are probably a couple million Venezuelan refugees, some in the US, some in surrounding countries that have fled over the last several years. But that situation took several years to develop, whereas here we've had 2 million or more refugees within less than 2 weeks.
Do you know what the official Biden policy is at this moment in terms of accepting large numbers of these Ukrainian refugees? And then how would they get here?
Two good questions. There is one official policy, which is that Ukrainians already in the U.S. have been granted temporary protected status, which means that for at least 18 months, they cannot be deported and they're allowed to work. On the other hand, to my knowledge, no special measures have been taken for people who arrive after March 1st, though some have been granted, a few hundred people, to my knowledge, have been granted refugee status or asylum status, based on sort of the regular processing, but obviously more could be done. How could they get here? I think different people in different ways, but many people who are in these European countries, some of which are relatively poor, at least by European standards, they may want to move on to somewhere else rather than live in very difficult conditions in Poland or Hungary or the like. So they could potentially, using normal means of transportation, get to the US or Canada or other countries further away, that because of our greater wealth and larger economies, there might be more job and other opportunities for them. Also, there are many Ukrainians who have friends or relatives in the US. We have a large Ukrainian diaspora in this country. I myself, I'm actually originally from Russia, but I have roots in Ukraine as well, as a great many Russians do. So there are those potential types of connections as well.
How does the number of the Ukrainian refugees compare with like the Afghanistan refugees? Is there any comparison in terms of the numbers?
The number in the US or the number more generally?
More generally, and then in the US.
So in the U.S., there's definitely right now more Afghans who have fled recently than Ukrainians who have fled recently. In terms of the total number of refugees, I'm not certain about this, but I think it is likely the total number is now greater for Ukraine than for Afghanistan. That's not necessarily because the Afghans are suffering less. It's in part because Afghanistan is more remote. So it's harder for Afghans to get to more affluent Western nations. But the Ukrainian refugee crisis is already so large that it is not only the largest in Europe since World War II, but is one of the probably 3 or 4 or 5 largest anywhere since World War II.
Could you imagine a situation where we would actually evacuate refugees from the Ukraine the way we saw the evacuation of Afghanistan? Is that feasible?
I can imagine it, but I think it's very unlikely because it would involve sending U.S. planes or troops into Ukraine. Biden and other NATO leaders have said they're not going to do that because it would likely involve U.S. forces clashing with Russian forces. In Afghanistan, we were able to do this because the Taliban did not have an air force or surface-to-air missiles and the like, and therefore there wasn't that much they could do to prevent U.S. planes from going in and out. Russia is a different story in that regard. But we can potentially help evacuate people who have already reached neighboring countries like Poland or Hungary. That's entirely feasible, and Russia probably cannot or would not prevent that.
Any predictions about where this goes? End of this conflict, number of refugees. What do you think happens next?
Obviously, I don't know for sure, but there is a high likelihood the conflict will continue for at least a few more weeks, and that the Russian forces will become more aggressive and bomb and attack civilians even more than they already have. If that occurs, there will be more refugees. The UN had said it could rise to as many as 4 or 5 million, and I think that's entirely plausible unless the conflict does end very quickly, which is not completely impossible, but doesn't seem like the most likely scenario.
And lastly, the money. We see a lot of efforts to raise money for the Ukrainian refugees. A lot of GoFundMe accounts have been set up. There are a lot of nonprofits that have been featured on various television shows. We've seen millions donated by Ashton Kutcher and his wife. Is it safe to donate to any of these funds, and where will the money go?
So obviously, as with any charitable donations, you want to donate to reputable organizations, ones that have a record of spending the money wisely, and certainly want to avoid quacks and charlatans. But there are well-known organizations that have helped refugees in various ways. There's the highest organization, HIIS, that I've worked with over the years. There's Catholic Charities. There's many others. There's specific Ukrainian organization as well. So people who want to donate, which is a good thing to do, just search around on the internet to make sure the organization you're donating to is reputable. It is not somebody that's trying to steal your money.
You said HIIS. What does that stand for?
HIIS. It stands for Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. They were started out helping Jewish immigrants, but over time they have branched out to help refugees generally, and they have an operation specifically dealing with Ukrainian refugees right now as well. There are many other organizations doing similar things also.
All right, great information. Thank you so much, Professor, for your insights. Again, his book is Free to Move, Foot Voting, Migration, and Political Freedom. I appreciate you sharing your insights with us on this really complex issue.
Thank you very much for having me.
My next guest is Professor Claire Finkelstein. She is a faculty director at the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law at the University of Pennsylvania, and she's also a faculty member at UPenn Law School. Welcome back to the show, Professor. You were just here on Tuesday, but so much has changed just in the last 2 days, and I want to focus on a couple of big developments. One being this incredible pressure that is mounting on the U.S. and other NATO countries to impose the no-fly zone. We talked about it a little on Tuesday, but tell us again, what is a no-fly zone?
A no-fly zone would mean that the U.S. and other NATO countries would say that no one can enter the airspace above Ukraine, and then be prepared to enforce it, so that if Russia flew planes into that zone, which of course they have been doing and using that airspace to conduct bombardments, the NATO allies would be prepared to shoot it down. So the U.S. has been very, very clear that they are not supporting a no-fly zone. President Zelensky has been asking for that repeatedly, and you understand why, which is that he is very concerned about the attacks that have been taking place on civilians. Russia is conducting most of those from the air, and in fact using illegal weapons, cluster bombs, to deliberately target both civilians who are trying to flee in violation of the laws of war and targeting civilian infrastructure, civilian buildings and dwellings. So this is a very, very important thing from Ukraine's standpoint, but I don't think that the NATO community is prepared to go there.
So one of the things we're starting to hear, Professor, is that there could be something called a limited humanitarian no-fly zone. What would be the difference if NATO and the U.S. were willing to impose this limited humanitarian no-fly zone?
Well, several times Russia and Ukraine have supposedly agreed to a ceasefire along humanitarian corridors for the purpose of getting civilians out of Ukraine. And Russia has repeatedly violated those agreements. Then recently they said, well, yes, we'd be willing to do a humanitarian exit zone so long as the corridors led to Russia or Belarus. And certainly Ukraine doesn't want to have to exit its civilians to Russia or Belarus. They want to go west to Poland and to Hungary. And so the idea of this limited no-fly zone for humanitarian purposes would be to enforce those agreements so that Russia will not be using Ukrainian airspace to target civilians who are trying to exit along agreed upon humanitarian exit corridors.
And one of the other things that has become a big issue now is this notion of the U.S. providing these jets, these fighter jets, to the Ukraine for the use of their military, not the U.S. flying them, but the U.S. making them available. Now there's this big back and forth between the U.S. and Poland. Just this morning, the news was out that the deal where the U.S. thought it was going to be supplying the jets to Poland, and Poland was going to directly send the jets to Ukraine. Poland springs on the U.S., according to reports, that no, they want the U.S. to deliver the jets to Germany and then be responsible for getting the jets to the Ukraine. It's perhaps snarling this trip that Vice President Harris had planned to go to Poland to show solidarity with our NATO allies. So what's this big dispute about, and why does it matter how the planes get to the Ukraine, whether they go through Poland or through Germany?
Look, it is critical that this gets solved. Let me start by saying that, because it's essential for Ukraine to have that equipment. First of all, they need the Polish planes, the MiG planes, because the former Soviet equipment is what the Ukrainian pilots know how to fly. And second of all, if we're not going to impose a no-fly zone, we have to help Ukraine gain air superiority so that they can stop these attacks, these Russian attacks from the air. So it's absolutely critical that this gets solved. So what's going on here? Well, Poland was opposed to the deal that the U.S. proposed of having the U.S. backfill the Polish supply of these planes by supplying U.S. planes in their place, and Poland would convey the planes. And the reason Poland didn't want to do that is understandable, is that they don't want to make themselves targetable by Russia, so that they don't want to be viewed as compromising their formal neutrality and inserting itself actively by actively participating in hostilities in the conflict, because they fear, and I think rightly so, that Russia may actually target Poland. Now, I think Russia is unlikely to do that, given that it's a NATO country. He knows that NATO will defend, as Secretary Blinken said from Latvia yesterday, and they know that the U.S. is not going to stand for an attack on Poland, but still the Poles are scared of this, worried about that, and So understandably don't want to be the ones to convey the planes to.
And is that the same issue the U.S. has? Is that why the U.S. doesn't want to take the planes themselves to Ukraine, because they don't want to be embroiled in the war so directly?
Exactly. The U.S. nobody wants to be the ones to convey these planes. Now, notice that this may really be an artificial line that everyone's drawing here, because all of these countries have been supplying small weaponry like javelins and other items. And so what's the difference between a javelin and a plane? I think it's fear of Russia's reaction, because the fear is that this is just too large a step. It shows you the importance of it for Ukraine and how significant the supply of those fighter jets is for the possibility of establishing Ukrainian air supremacy. And Russia will regard it as a threat, a very significant threat, there's no doubt. But I don't think they're going to turn around and bomb the U.S. or Poland, for that matter, if it does supply these weapons.
Yeah, Zelensky came out with a video slamming the U.S. and Poland, saying, look, you're treating us like a ping pong ball. You're shifting responsibility. And in the meantime, our civilians are getting hammered with these, bombs and attacks from the air from Russia. Let me ask you this. I'm no expert in this, and I'm getting up to speed, I think, as most of the country is, as we're watching this get played out in real time. But how come the Ukrainian military flyers, pilots can't go to Poland, which is a bordering, Poland borders the Ukraine, go there by some means of transportation, get the jets themselves and fly them back to their country? And that way, if there's if Russia shoots down a plane, it is shooting down a Ukrainian military force that's flying the plane. It's not Poland soldiers or the U.S. soldiers. Is that too
I love your suggestion, and I was just talking to someone this morning who suggested the same thing. So just, leave the key in and the motor running and say, you know what, we're going to just go home and leave these jets here. You might want to come get them.
Yeah, is that too simplistic? Are you and I thinking about this in a way that, would never be how a military operation would be conducted?
I think it's possible. It may be that Ukraine doesn't have the bandwidth, but they're obviously in a terrible state of siege, and I don't know what's required to convey the equipment, but it seems to me that that is a very real possibility. Now, Ukraine has to be able to get those pilots safely out of Ukraine and get them into German airspace or wherever the planes are gonna land up, and get them out of there. And it may be that they don't feel that they can do that safely. They'd obviously have to do it in a very clandestine way, because Russia may attack any attempt to get a large number of fighter pilots out of Ukraine. And so the logistics, my guess is that there are a lot of discussions about it, but that the logistics are complicated. But I can understand the difficulties of the reverse logistics in having a NATO country try to convey this equipment. Unfortunately, I'm not an expert in the details of how a military transfer of equipment in that sense can be made.
Yeah, I saw an expert last night say that the U.S. and NATO countries are making too much of the danger, and that it's not as dangerous as people are making it sound, because Russia doesn't control the airspace over Ukraine, and that the trip is short, like a 20-minute trip from Poland to the Ukraine, and that these planes could be deployed pretty easily with very little danger. But that doesn't seem to be the majority opinion. I've heard one expert opine in that manner. Are you hearing that? And she questioned whether there was the resolve, which I don't know if I believe that. I do believe the resolve is there by the U.S. and the NATO countries to help Ukraine as much as it can. But what do you make of that assessment, that this is not that difficult, it's not dangerous, just do it?
I agree with the sentiment, just do it. I think this has to happen. This transfer has to happen. But I don't agree on the idea that it's not dangerous. There's no question that any kind of large equipment movement in and out of Ukraine, however it's accomplished, with Ukrainian pilots going to pick them up or Polish pilots flying them in, however you look at it, is going to be a dangerous mission. But I think it absolutely has to be done. Ukraine is facing all sorts of dangers, and frankly, we are facing dangers as NATO allies in an escalating situation that is very hard to believe will end up with NATO countries being able to stay out of the fray. I think we have to be able to take some risks for the sake of saving Ukraine. I absolutely don't agree that we can draw a sharp line at NATO boundaries and keep all of Western Europe safe while we ignore what's happening in Ukraine and in non-NATO countries. The risk of escalation if Ukraine falls is enormous. There are non-NATO countries like Moldova and Finland who border on Russia and who Russia presumably regards as part of its former Soviet empire, and Putin would love to annex those countries as well, we can only assume. Right. And so I think we ignore, and I don't say that the US or NATO is ignoring the situation, but we allow Ukraine to fall at our peril, at the peril of Western Europe, and really at the peril of democracy more generally. I think we need to find a way to protect Ukraine, and this is the right next step.
Yeah, this is really complicated because we saw yesterday, too, the ban by the U.S. on Russian oil imports. And some say that's the ultimate sanction because Russia depends so heavily on its oil imports for its, revenue for its country. But this ban and the other sanctions are obviously having an impact on U.S. Right now, Republicans and Democrats seem united behind that, but everyone's expecting come midterms, the Republicans are going to be blaming the Democrats for these $5 and $6 and $7 gas prices we're seeing at the pump. So, yes, I hear what you're saying about democracy and the need to support democracy around the world. But are Americans, you think, ready to pay the price in the short term with high oil prices, high gas prices? Because to support democracy and to prevent Ukraine from completely being taken over by Russia is going to require a great amount of sacrifice on the part of Americans.
I need to beg to differ with you on a couple of small issues there, Areva, but on the larger picture, you're right. The smaller issue is that, the U.S. gets only 8% roughly of its oil and gas from Russia. That's a pretty trivial amount compared to the amount that we both produce domestically and get from the Saudis. So I don't think that the U.S. is going to feel enormous pressures in this regard. The issue is not the U.S. for this particular ban. And I have an op-ed that came out yesterday on this right after the announcement of President Biden, which is the main issue is Western Europe. Because Europe, the European Union gets more like 40% of its oil and gas. So I think—
And most of those countries have not imposed a ban because of their dependence.
The German Chancellor said a couple of days ago that it is not feasible for Germany to follow suit. Now, I might beg to differ with that, but the main purpose of President Biden's announcement yesterday, I believe, is not only to take what's largely a symbolic stance with regard to Russia, but to try to inspire Western Europe to follow our lead.
But how can they, Professor, follow the lead, since you just, and thank you for correcting me, that the U.S. dependence on Russia's oil is small compared to Western Europe. So we're able to take the hit because we're not depending on their oil for a great part of our supply anyhow. But how can these countries that have a 40% dependence ban the imports and continue, to function?
Yeah, that's really the question. In the case of Germany, it's even higher. I understand more like 55%. So Germany in particular has been very, very dependent on Russia for its energy source. I'm not an expert in energy policy. However, I believe that Europe does have alternatives and that they have a great interest in finding those alternatives because, look, we can't continue to have democracies held up by these sort of petro-autocracies that use their position with regard to energy supply to really strong arm other nations into complying with their non-democratic ideals and plans. We have to free ourselves if democracy is to be preserved from the leverage that Russia has on our systems of government, in effect. And we see what sort of coddling Russia has done over the years, our failure to respond to what Russia did in Crimea in 2014 is part of what brought us to this point. And we're at a much more dangerous place here than we were in 2014. So
are you seeing any movement, and maybe it's too soon after Biden's announcement, any movement on the part of any of those Western European countries to suggest they're going to follow suit?
Well, the UK has said it will phase out Russian imports by the end of the year. That's not soon enough to help Ukraine. This has to be done sooner, but that's at least a little bit of movement. And I think it's very much under discussion in Europe. I'm sure that they are working hard to try to figure out what alternative energy sources they can muster. Germany has been out ahead of the US and other European nations in moving towards green energy sources and renewable energy. And clearly they need to keep moving in that direction. But none of that is going to happen fast enough. I would suggest that if Germany were to announce, if the EU were to announce at least a temporary cessation of imports from Russia, announce it as an emergency measure for a month. They can use their reserves to get through that period, I would think. If it meant living without power to some portions of the European economy and titrating the amount of oil and gas that's used, I would think it would be worth it. Because the threat to Western Europe from allowing Putin to go unchecked in Ukraine and allowing Ukraine to fall is so significant and such a threat to European democracy that I think they would protect their energy sources at the cost of their democracy.
And just final question, Professor, I asked you this a couple of days ago, and I'll ask you again. Any confidence that there's going to be a quick resolution to this unprovoked attack? We're in week 2, going into week 3. We've seen the atrocities. We've seen the thousands of civilians who have lost their lives, the close to 2 million that have had to flee the country. Any hope that there is a diplomatic resolution on the horizon?
There's no diplomatic resolution on the horizon. The only thing that could resolve it quickly would be Putin suddenly feeling that he cannot sustain this campaign and turning around and hightailing it out of there on some pretext. I give that about as much likelihood as a diplomatic solution, namely just about none. And the other direction, if Putin is to prevail quickly and Ukraine were to fall, I don't think that would end the conflict because Ukrainians are going to keep fighting for their independence. So if Russia ends up occupying all of Ukraine and trying to establish some kind of puppet government in Ukraine to do Moscow's bidding, the Ukrainian people are going to keep fighting against that. And we are going to keep supporting Ukraine to try to liberate it from any such occupation. So I don't think that Putin has any easy road here to victory. There are easy roads to ending the conflict, but Putin right now is insufficiently motivated to take them.
Yeah, I think, and it's been said over and over again that Russia, Putin did not anticipate the formidable response, the opposition that would be put forth by the Ukrainian people. And some are saying that resolve by the Ukrainian people is only causing Putin to become more entrenched in his efforts to prevail. But others are saying, as you just said, that poses a significant risk for him moving forward, that there is no win that he can accomplish in this situation because
Areva, I think both are true. I think both are true. So he is doubling down for sure. And the Putin playbook seems to be that if he starts to lose fighting according to conventional rules of war, though he's violated them in invading Ukraine in the first place, but conventional methods of war, he will up the ante and start committing war crimes in order to try to prevail. And that shows what he's capable of. We should not underestimate the degree of barbarity that Putin will have Russian troops go to. We see some resistance on the part of Russian troops, an extraordinary video that came out a couple of days ago from a Russian policeman calling on Russian soldiers to step down. But none of that is going to happen quickly. And I think Putin will keep trying to up the ante, but the more he pushes the envelope on humanitarian attacks and war crimes, the more he is daring NATO to intervene, the more difficult I think it will be for us to stay out of the conflict. And also, I think the more he really seals the beginning of the opposition to his rule, both in Moscow and for troops on the ground in Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, we've got to leave it there. Thank you so much, Professor, for your insights. Obviously, this is just an ever-evolving nightmare for the people of the Ukraine, and our prayers continue to go out to them as we pray and hope for some solution that spares the lives of these women and children and family that we see, in these desperate attempts to save their lives and their livelihood. So we'll be talking with you, I'm sure, in the future, because so much is happening and getting played out in real time. Again, thank you for your time and your insights.
Thank you, Areva.
Experts on this matter, because for many of us, this is the first time that we have literally watched a war like this, an unprovoked attack from Russia, get played out in real time on every television, on every news site that we literally watch throughout the day. So I am grateful for an opportunity to talk to these experts who can help us understand what is happening, not only in the Ukraine, but how it relates to our day-to-day lives here in the United States. So I want to again thank all of my experts for joining me this morning, and thanks to you for tuning in, because again, this does impact us. It may seem like this is happening far, far, far away from the U.S. soil, but as we have heard time and time again from all of the experts, this is something that every American should be concerned about, because we're fighting. The fight in Ukraine is really the fight for democracy. So some really simple words to live by, and that's prayer without works are dead. As citizens, as civilians, we don't have the power of government to act. So we have to pray. We have to pray for the Ukrainian people. We have to pray for our U.S. government that they make the right decisions. We have to pray for the leaders of the NATO countries that they are making the right decisions. But then we have to ask our government and demand that our government act to prevent Russia from toppling the Ukraine and destroying democracy in Western Europe. All right, y'all, I'm out. Be safe out there, wear your mask, and remember, we're all in this together.